Over the years, people have asked many times what those symbols on the pulpit in the main sanctuary mean. And so I decided this year that as the days come up in the church year, we're going to talk about those symbols. And if you were here back in April, you already heard Bishop Patelko talk about one of them, the lion, who represents St. Mark. And today we're going to discuss the winged human. On the front of your bulletin is a picture of that symbol that's on the pulpit in the main sanctuary. The winged human, and that represents St. Matthew, which is his feast day is today. Each of the symbols represents one of the four evangelists: the human, Matthew; the lion, Mark; the ox, Luke; and the eagle, John. Luke will come up next month, and actually Pastor Jack Gilbert will be here to preach that day on St. Luke, and then we'll talk about St. John in December. Well, St. Matthew represents the humanity of Christ and his call to all of us who are so completely human. Matthew is that fully human disciple who, like Christ, was really wanted by no one. He was rejected by the Jews because he worked for the Romans. He was a tax collector for Rome. And the way tax collectors made their money is they took extra and they padded their own pockets before they paid Rome. And of course he was rejected by the Romans because he was a Jew. So it's that same story that's told over and over and over again in middle school, right? We try to get with one group by sacrificing our relationship with another group, only to be cast out by the group that we're trying to get with. And we end up abandoned because the group we wanted to be with never wanted us in the first place, and we burned our bridges with the group we were with in the first place. So there's Matthew sitting in his tax booth. And I'm certain that he fully expected to be snubbed by Jesus, because Jesus was a rabbi. Have you ever noticed how people who are not well loved sometimes act even more unlovable? It's sort of like they make proactive strikes so they won't be disappointed when you fail to love them. And see, Matthew didn't know it, but he was the perfect example of a Christian. There he was, a sinner in desperate need of salvation. And instead of snubbing him, as he anticipated, I'm sure, Jesus looks right at him and says, "Follow me." And he did. Now that doesn't make any sense, does it? Why would someone despised by the Jews get up and follow a rabbi? Now, the word of Jesus gives us the strength to do things that we never thought possible. Matthew is represented as a man because he is every human being. We are all so aware of our inadequacies and our sinfulness. We might try to cover it up with rationalizations and bravado, but deep down we know that we are poor, miserable sinners, which is why some people hate saying those words in the confession, because the truth is too hard to hear. The incongruence between what we do, what we say, and what we think, and what we know to be right, both from God's law and our own conscience, that distance is great. And that incongruence between those two things makes us kind of uncomfortable. And therein lies the problem. How do we address that incongruence, that distance between the life we have and the godly life? So at the dinner that Matthew and Jesus attended that night, some had decided that outward show was what really counted. Look good. Look holy. Make all the outwardly pious choices in life. Some things don't change, do they? There's still a lot of Christians running around who live that way. Never say bad words in front of other Christians, no matter how you talk about it. Just lie to your kids. Never tell them the naughty things that you did, the sinful things that you thought that God saved you from. And by all means, sneak out of your house when you go to the bar at night and then tell all your Christian friends that you were at home the whole night watching reruns of The Waltons. In other words, live fakely righteous. And so many Christians strive to do that. Why? You don't fool God, and He's the only one who counts anyway. And that's why Luther advised us that if we're going to sin, sin boldly. In other words, sit with that reality that you are imperfect. Sit with that reality that you are going to make imperfect decisions and imperfect choices. And rely on Jesus, because people like you and Matthew are exactly who He came to save. If we were righteous on our own, we wouldn't need Jesus, folks. And I think that's why Matthew was ready. It's why he was ready to drop everything and to just blindly follow Jesus. Because, you know what? It's hard to grab on to Jesus when you're carrying around so many excuses. It's hard to grab onto Jesus when you're trying to shuffle all of those justifications that prop up your facade. But when you're ready to just set down all the baggage, you suddenly find that you have two hands, two arms to throw around Jesus' neck. He knew that Jesus knew what it was to be Him. To sin and sin and sin and never seem to be able to get out of that cesspool. It's Jesus' simple statement that He came to save sinners that frees us. It frees us from doing what we always do and following Him instead. So how about you? Are you like Matthew? Are you ready to drop all your worldly achievements and all of your rationalizations for why you have to sin? You have no choice after all. All your earthly demands for position and status and notoriety, and follow Christ. Christ is fully human. He knows all the nasty little worldly things with which you are enmeshed. And yet He calls you. He knows fully well every single sinful idea that tempts you. And yet He calls you. He does not call the person who acts contrite enough, or the person who's making sacrifices to try to pay for their own sins. He calls us, the Matthews of the world, who are just blindly blundering through life and often don't know which way to turn. He calls us. He looks at us and says to us, "Follow me." And by power invested through His word and His holy body and blood, we do.